Happy Bitcoin Infinity Day! Today, of course, is August 21st, which has become the day we celebrate the finite quality of the hardest money ever discovered, but it is also DCA Wednesday, a day where we continue our journey down the rabbit hole $20 at a time. This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and/or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy. Hello, you sexy sat stackers, and welcome to the latest episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. Today is Wednesday, August 21st, 2024, and as I mentioned in the intro, it is Bitcoin Infinity Day. It is unknown or disagreed upon exactly who came up with the idea of Bitcoin Infinity Day, but I have always attributed it to Knut Svanholm, who started talking about it while he was working on his famous book titled Everything Divided by 21 Million. Now, the book was published in 2022, but he started talking about the book at least several months, maybe a year or so beforehand, while he was writing it. And then, of course, while he was promoting it before it was even released. And I think it came out in like February of 2022. So he'd been saying Bitcoin is everything divided by 21 million since at least 2021, if not earlier. If you have been out of the loop, so to speak, the idea is that the infinity symbol looks a lot like a figure eight if you were to turn the 8 sideways. So the date, August 21st, at least among those of us who write the date in the month, day, year format, would be 8/21, i.e. infinity divided by 21. I have to apologize if there's any background noise bleeding through. This microphone is pretty good at capturing only the sound coming from directly in front of it. But we're in the middle of a series of thunderstorms that have been moving across the state, and they're not expected to stop anytime soon. They're supposed to go pretty much all night. Maybe they'll fizzle out a little bit later as it cools off because, the afternoon sun radiating down on the earth has an awful lot to do with the formation of these thunderstorms. But it's actually quite refreshing as long as the thunder doesn't interfere with the recording. And even if we lose the power, I'm recording on my laptop today. So even if we lose power, I should be able to continue recording. And we haven't actually had any rain for quite a while. Probably not quite a while for a lot of people where it doesn't rain as much as it rains here in Florida. But it seems like it's been forever. It seems like it's been a couple of weeks since we've had any rain. Here on the Space Coast, it's rained in the center part of Florida. One of the things about being out here on the Barrier Island is often we get the thunderstorms building up just a few miles to the west. Basically down, if you're familiar with Florida, where Interstate 95 runs all the way down the not the coast of Florida, it's not right along the water, but where it runs north to south from Miami to Jacksonville before heading all the way up to, New York and further north. But I digress. Usually the sea breeze thunderstorms, or often the sea breeze thunderstorms, don't make it past that, about the Interstate 95 area. And it's frustrating because you can hear the thunder when it's that close. You can see it. You can see the dark clouds. You can see the rain coming down. But I'll be out in the yard watering my plants to make sure they don't wilt. That is not the case today. Those showers have been marching across the entire state. They've been doing it all afternoon, and they're supposed to continue doing it all night. So if the thunder gets particularly egregious, I hope it won't be too distracting. But I'm set up to record through the storm, whether we lose power or not. And like I said, it's actually quite refreshing. It had been really, really hot without the thunderstorms. Today it's been nice and cool. Even though it's been stormy, it's only been about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 23.8 Celsius, for those of you who don't use Fahrenheit. But I digress. Many of you don't actually know this, but besides being the shark bite capital of the world, Central Florida is also the lightning strike capital of the world. And this is because of those sea breeze thunderstorms. They're induced a lot like the daily afternoon thunderstorms you get in the mountains during the summertime, except for the uplift that results in the storms is it's caused by the winds coming off the ocean on either side of Florida, colliding with the warm, hot air, the warm, moist air in the middle of the state. And so it's almost like clockwork. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're going to have thunder showers, except for when they're not powerful enough to make it all the way back to the ocean. But later in the summer, particularly this time of year, they end up marching all the way to the ocean and then disappearing out to sea. Amongst other things, in case you haven't noticed, I've always been kind of a weather nerd. This is part of the allure for me of living in Florida. A lot of people are afraid to live in Florida because of the hurricanes or tornadoes that are associated usually just with the hurricanes. But sometimes in the winter when you get the cold fronts, I say cold front loosely because they're the storms that cause the big severe winter snowstorms throughout most of the United States. By the time it gets down here to Florida, it's just rain, but it's a lot cooler. Sometimes it drops down into the 50s, gets even closer to freezing, although I've never actually seen it hit the freezing point while I've lived in Florida. Allegedly it has, but not in the last 25 years or so. But I digress. There have only been a few years here and there, a few months here and there where I haven't owned a personal weather station, at least for the last couple decades. And the only reason I haven't had a personal weather station from time to time is because even the really expensive quote unquote marine grade stations I've purchased tend to seize up after a while. They just cannot handle the salt. I don't live directly on the beach. I live a couple blocks away. So usually the salt isn't as bad as it is right on the beach, but when it gets windy, when it gets stormy, I'll go outside and my car will be glistening from just being covered in salt from the salt spray coming off the ocean. And that is hard on anything. I mean, salt is just an oppressive force of nature, so to speak, and it is extraordinarily corrosive. So even those quote unquote marine grade weather stations tend to only last like a year or two. So at the moment, I'm trying out my latest new station, and this is an ambient weather WS 5000. And I say trying out the WS 5000 because this is the first weather station I've ever had that uses an ultrasonic wind sensor array instead of a mechanical anemometer and a wind vane to measure the wind speed and direction. So far, it's been extremely accurate, and I'm pretty happy with it. The only caveat being that it is only supposed to be accurate up to about 86 miles per hour, which is about 138 kilometers per hour, which is a really, really strong wind. It's a really fast wind speed, but it's significantly slower than the peak winds we've had during the last few hurricanes. So that being said, if we're in the middle of a Category 2 or stronger hurricane, the chances are the power is already out. Often the power goes out while we have just strong tropical storm force winds blowing. So the weather station won't be reporting anyway if it hasn't just flat out blown away. Although I did have a weather station on a building that I own, a business that I was running at the time, which was right on the beach. And I had a pretty good anchor. I had a pretty strong mast set up on the roof of that building. And I put some guide wires down on it to secure it even more so. And it rode out both Irma and Matthew. And Irma removed the hotel right across the street. The building I'm talking about is it's on Highway A1A, which does run up and down the beach. And so on the ocean side of A1A, there was a hotel. And then this building was on the other side of A1A. So one small mom and pop style, bungalow hotel away from the ocean. And that hotel ended up getting pretty much erased and ending up in the front yard of the building where this weather station was. It was the strongest hurricane we've had in quite a while. And we were without power for more than a week. The power lines were down on the road. Trees were down everywhere. Everything was gray and then brown. There was nothing green from all the salt burn, even if the wind didn't strip all the vegetation away, which it did. But that which it didn't strip away, like even your grass in your front yard was killed off by the salt, just the ocean water blowing in the wind. But that weather station did not blow away. So I guess if I'd had this weather station and it didn't let me know what the peak wind speed was for that hurricane, which was over 100 miles an hour. I don't remember specifically what it was, but well over 100 miles an hour. Now, that would be kind of disappointing. But I'm getting off on a really significant tangent here. And as always, there's a lot of actual Bitcoin news to talk about today. So we're going to get into that in a second. But before we do, we're going to take our customary look at Bitcoin's vital statistics. At the time of this recording, we are sitting at a block height of 857,825. And Bitcoin is clocking in at a US dollar price of 61,400 US dollars per Bitcoin, which is up about 3,000, a little more than 3,000, almost $3,500 from last DCA Wednesday. And that means that we're going to receive 1,629 sats for every US dollar that we convert into Bitcoin today. And of course, we're going to convert $20 with the Bitcoin. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, But whatever amount you're converting, and of course this is a you do you thing, you'll currently receive 1,629 sats for each of those US dollars. Bitcoin's current US dollar price gives it a market capitalization of $1.21 trillion, significantly above the $1 trillion mark that I've always said is that magic number for the normies, that once Bitcoin hit $1 trillion, that's when it will really, really resonate in the brain of the average normie or the financial media, mainstream media types, that Bitcoin is here to stay, that it's really a force to be reckoned with. Of course, the $1.21 trillion puts it about in the ballpark of the market capitalization of silver. Some figures say that this is actually higher than silver's market cap. Other figures say it's just under silver's market cap. And of course, the market cap of silver and gold is kind of an estimate, because unlike Bitcoin, nobody knows exactly how much silver or gold there is above the ground at any given time, particularly with silver, which is used so heavily as an industrial metal. Gold still has industrial uses as well, and it's turned into jewelry and things like that. It isn't all in coins or bars or ingots tucked away in some vault somewhere, but silver even more so, because a lot of silver is used in electronics. So we're going to use the $1.31 trillion market cap that I've been using ever since we've been talking about silver's market cap on this podcast, just for the purposes of being consistent. So with that in mind, Bitcoin is just under silver's market cap and significantly below gold's market cap, which is still ringing in at, now it's significantly more than 14 trillion. So for those of you who are worried that you've missed out on all of the Bitcoin gains, that you're no longer early, if Bitcoin just becomes the digital replacement for gold, which I firmly believe it will not do not only that, it will go beyond that, but a bare minimum, since Bitcoin is even being recognized by many gold bugs like Larry Lepard, for example, as the digital equivalent of gold, the fastest horse in that race, though. That means that for Bitcoin to do that, its price would have to increase to the point where it'd be basically 14x from where we are now, which 14x would be a heck of a return for any asset. So you're still early. You're still way early, but still early even if Bitcoin were only to become digital gold. And speaking of gold, for those of you who still value your wealth in those shiny yellow rocks, it will currently cost you 24.5 ounces of gold to purchase just one Bitcoin, up about 0.6 ounces, a little more than a half an ounce from last DCA Wednesday. So even though the price of gold is setting all-time highs because the US dollar is being devalued, and gold, of course, is that traditional hedge against inflation. So even with gold at its all-time record high or near its all-time record high, it is still trending to zero in Bitcoin terms, and it will continue to do so as Bitcoin eats its lunch, so to say. But currently, if you are a gold bug, it will cost you 24.5 ounces of your shiny, precious Peter Schiff bucks to purchase just one Bitcoin. For those of you who value your wealth in pizza, one Bitcoin would currently purchase you 3,434 large pepperoni pizzas from Papa John's. If you were to try and eat an entire Bitcoin in the form of a daily pizza, that means you could purchase one large pepperoni pizza every day for almost 9.5 years. And that, of course, would be assuming that you locked in the current price of Bitcoin, that Bitcoin didn't continue going up and to the right, because that is more than 2 additional halving cycles from now. 9.5 years from now, we will have had this halving cycle that we're currently starting. We would have had the 2028 halving cycle, and then we would have had the 2032 halving cycle, because we'd be talking 2033. So we would be right in the middle of the next of 3 face melting bull runs from now. So who knows? Well, God only knows what the price of Bitcoin will be then. If we continue having these 4-year cycles, then we would have had 2 major appreciation events and be starting the 3rd by then. And if Bitcoin breaks free from the halving cycle, as many people will forecast that it will do, that mythical, that legendary, the so-called super cycle, where Bitcoin just keeps going up and to the right forever and never has those 50 to 80% retracements, those Bitcoin winters and accumulation phases in between halving dates. Whether or not that happens, either way, the price of Bitcoin should be significantly more expensive than it is now, which is why I say we've passed the Bitcoin singularity, or the pizza singularity, where if you had one Bitcoin, as long as you didn't cash it in and lock in the current US dollar value and then lose it all to inflation, that would be silly. Why would you be in Bitcoin in the first place? But if you did, then theoretically it would take you 9.4 years to eat that Bitcoin wealth one large pizza at a time. That metric that you know has been my favorite for most of this podcast, or all of this podcast history, that is Bitcoin's 24-hour average transaction rate, is up significantly, almost 2 full transactions per second more than last DCA Wednesday. Last DCA Wednesday, it was coming in at 5.92 transactions per second on average. And right now we're seeing 7.79 transactions per second on average. And so, again, this isn't any official TA. I don't know if anybody else is talking about this besides me. This is just something I've noticed every Wednesday when I do this podcast, that when the transaction volume is soaring, the price of Bitcoin is soaring. And so the average transaction rate is up significantly from last DCA Wednesday, and the price of Bitcoin is up quite a bit from last DCA Wednesday as well. So just, an interesting anecdote. Of course, correlation doesn't equal causation, but for more than 3 years now, it has appeared that is the case, at least. It's fun to look at either way. Obviously, I say nobody has a crystal ball, and on a day-to-day basis, there is no way to predict what the price of Bitcoin is going to be or what it's going to do. Even that transaction volume, I would say, can't predict the price of Bitcoin. It's just fun to look at. Speaking of on-chain transactions, Clark Moody's dashboard lists the number of transactions in their mempool at 176,688. That is down more than 30,000 transactions from last DCA Wednesday, but mempool.space is showing a slightly different story. They always do. They have a slightly larger mempool. They always have for the history of this podcast, and they're showing 264,432 transactions pending their mempool, which is actually an increase of about 14,000 transactions. So one mempool is telling one story, and the other mempool is telling a slightly different story. But either way, 176,000 or 264,000, that's a lot of transactions pending in the mempools out there. So a lot of network activity on chain, and that is a good sign. That means that people and institutions, et cetera, are using Bitcoin robustly, and that's what it's meant for. So that's really cool. And speaking of on-chain transactions, if you're looking to move Bitcoin on-chain, if you're not using Lightning or one of the other layer 2s, Clark Moody's fee estimator is, it's saying almost the same thing as last week. It's saying that if you have a high priority transaction that you want to guarantee is mined in the very next block or two, that you need to include a fee of 5 sats per VByte. That's the same as it's recommended the last 3 weeks in a row. They're saying if you have up to a day to wait, that you can include a fee of just 3 sats per VByte. And if you have more than a day, the lowest fee they're recommending is 2 sats per VByte. Mempool.space is actually recommending a slightly higher fee than they were last week. Last week, their high priority fee was just 3 sats per VByte. And right now they're saying that you need to include 4 sats per VByte in fees if you want to guarantee your transactions mined in the next block. That works out to about 34 cents in US dollar terms. But looking at mempool.space, I'm noticing that the last couple of blocks to come in the very last block that just came in 2 minutes ago had a fee range of 3 sats per VByte to 171 sats per VByte. So 3 sat for VByte fees were being mined. The block before that took almost double the normal block time. It took about 20 minutes to come in, and that's when we saw a little bit of a fee spike, although it's hard to call going from 3 sats to 5 sats a fee spike, but I think that's what skewed this recommendation a little bit. I think if blocks keep marching in that 10-minute average or less, as the case may be right now, it looks like they're averaging a little faster than 10 minutes. Then I think the 3 sats per VByte, we'll see that come back down to where they're recommending just 3 sats per VByte, even for a priority transaction. This is all, of course, moot. I'm just going over the statistics so we can get a general idea of the state of the network. If you decide that you need to do an on-chain transaction, unless you're making it right now, you'll want to make sure you get the most up-to-date information before you commit to a fee. If you're using a wallet that lets you name your own fee precisely, as opposed to most wallets give you a fee range recommendation. For example, they might say priority or medium or no priority, and you just click priority and then it sets the fee. But I prefer to set my own fees. Most advanced users, I assume, do. Right now, mempool.space is actually recommending 4 sats per VByte for any transaction. That's the highest fee they recommend and the lowest fee they recommend, even for a no priority transaction. And quite frankly, That's still, we're talking 34 cents in US dollar terms for a transaction you can send to anyone, anywhere in the world, instantly, with instant final settlement, without permission from anyone, that can't be clawed back, can't be disputed. It's permanent and final immediately, as opposed to like a wire transfer, which is going to cost you, you can send a quote unquote wire transfer, like a MoneyGram at like Walmart, for I think as cheap as $4, but it's not quite the same as sending an international wire transfer. International wire transfers get really expensive depending on where you're sending them. The prices vary by country, but we're talking 25, 30, 50 or more dollars to send an international wire transfer. And even then, it takes about a week to 10 days for them to settle before they're official. And even then, your bank can always claw that transaction back, because that's the way the legacy finance system works, as opposed to Bitcoin, which is a push transaction. Those are pull transactions, and they have up to, I think, 6 months or more before everything is ultimately settled, at least on the US dollar system. And speaking of blocks, we are almost exactly halfway between difficulty adjustments. For those who do not know, the difficulty it takes to mine a block of Bitcoin is adjusted every 2016 blocks, which is theoretically once every 2 weeks, with the goal of blocks coming in at an average time of 10 minutes in between blocks. We're now 991 blocks away from the next halving, so just a little over halfway. That works out to about 7 days from now. It looks like that's going to be on August 28th. And depending where you get your data, that's going to be a difficulty increase of anywhere between 1.05 to 2.7%. And that is because blocks are coming in a little bit faster than 10 minutes. They're currently averaging 10 minutes and 7 seconds between blocks, but that time has been trending up. And that is because it is estimated that there are 628.1 exahashes of mining power securing the network. And that is a little more than 6 exahashes more than last DCA Wednesday, which works out to about 1% currently. And so those estimators take that into account, but they also take into account the average over the entire, over not just this epoch, which is, about 1,000 blocks old, but sometimes they take into account the previous 2016 blocks. So this epoch, and then maybe a little bit before the last adjustment. Each data source is a little bit different. And that's why one's recommending or forecasting a 1% increase, and the other's forecasting almost a 3% increase. And none of this is anything more than just an educated guess, because a lot of things can happen in the next week between now and about August 28th. That date's subject to change as well. For example, last Wednesday, it was looking like blocks were coming in to the point where this difficulty adjustment wouldn't be happening to the 29th. So a lot like the halving tends to slide earlier. In this case, the difficulty adjustment has moved up by a day as well. But like I said, a lot of things can happen, especially when we have these large commercial miners that have, these load balancing agreements, these power sharing agreements where they turn off their miners. They get paid to turn off their miners in times of peak demand, especially when there's extreme demand during like a heat wave in the summer or a cold snap, a severe winter storm in the winter. And so if something like that happens, exahash drops off, and that slows block times down, and then that changes what happens at the next difficulty adjustment. Or everything keeps humming along smoothly, and more miners come pouring onto the network, and more advanced miners replace some of the older miners, and that increases the overall hash rate securing the network, and then we get a larger difficulty adjustment. The point being, Bitcoin takes all of this into account, and that's why they adjust the block time, or the difficulty every 2016 blocks, to try and keep blocks averaging 10 minutes between blocks. And that's one of the more genius parts of the Bitcoin code, in my humble opinion. Real quick, I want to take a minute to thank those of you listening on your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Podcasting 2.0 allows you to support this podcast through the value for value method by either streaming sats on a minute-by-minute basis as you listen, or by sending a boost. A boost, of course, is a shout out via the Lightning Network, a Lightning transaction where you can let us know what you think about the podcast, let us know what's going on in your community, or even just say hi. But because it is a Lightning transaction, you are sending value back to the podcast in the form of Satoshis. We do not have any boosts to read this week, but we do have a lot of you out there who have been supporting the podcast via Value for Value. And even if you do not have the means or the wherewithal to send value back to this podcast, you should still be listening on Fountain, because Fountain actually even lets you earn Satoshis just for listening to your favorite podcasts. So why wouldn't you listen on Fountain instead of one of the big tech apps? You don't earn a lot of Satoshis. It's randomly assigned how much you're going to earn. For example, I listened to a podcast last night and I only earned 10 Satoshis for doing so. And a couple nights ago, I didn't earn anything, but then I've earned 100 Satoshis or 120 Satoshis a couple times during the last week for listening to podcasts I'm going to listen to anyway. And that might not seem like a lot, but it reminds me of back in the day when they had the Bitcoin faucets. And they were giving you 5 Bitcoin a day just for visiting a website, just to spread Bitcoin around and get people interested in it. And 5 Bitcoin at the time was basically nothing. Think of it as like the value of just a couple of Satoshis. But we certainly know how much 5 Bitcoin is worth now. And I firmly believe that this is kind of the same thing. Maybe, the Satoshis you earn won't be $100,000 or $1 million worth of Satoshis one day. But, if we hit dollar sat parity, which is $100 million of Bitcoin, could happen. Seems like a long ways away, even if it does happen. But, that'd be $10 just for listening to your favorite podcast. Even if Bitcoin only hits $1 million, that's like getting $1 just for listening to your favorite podcast. And that is on the days when you only earn 10 sats. The day when I earned 120 sats, it would have been like earning $12 or $120 if Bitcoin hits $100 million one day. I'm getting off on a tangent. Podcasting 2.0 is great because it takes the power away from the big tech companies that currently dominate, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever the normies listen to their podcast. And in addition to that, it allows you to help support your favorite podcasts, this one included, by streaming or boosting sats. Speaking of our listeners, our geographic distribution of listeners has remained ossified. It hasn't changed since July 17th. That little disclaimer about the stats being delayed is not there currently, so I'm going to assume these are accurate stats. The fact that they haven't moved is encouraging that they are accurate, because our listenership does not move that much. We see little changes from time to time. The last big change, of course, was on July 17th. But currently, more than half of you are listening from the United States. So thank you to those of you listening in the United States. I don't currently see which states you are listening from, so I don't know whether you're from Florida, Texas, New York, California, Idaho, wherever you may be, just that you are in the United States. Quite frankly, speaking of boosts and value for value, we've never gotten a shout out from any of my US-based listeners. So if you are listening from some state that I haven't mentioned, and you are a fan of this podcast and you want to contribute value for value back, send us a shout out and let me know where you're listening from, because it's cool to know what our top 10 countries are. But since over half of you are in the United States, it'd be fun to know where in the United States you're listening from. Number 2 remains Argentina. So hola, muchas gracias amigos in Argentina. Number 3 remains Germany. So I guess it's Abend now. The sun has just gone down. Guten Abend, mein Freunde in Deutschland. Danke für alles. Number 4 remains Canada. So thank you to those of you listening north of us in Canada. Number 5 remains Luxembourg. So again, Dankeschön, mein Freunde in Luxembourg, or Morien to those of you who speak Luxembourgish. Number 6 remains Spain. Hola, muchas gracias amigos in Spain. Number 7 remains Colombia. Again, hola, muchas gracias amigos in Colombia. Number 8 remains Mexico. So hola, muchas gracias amigos in Mexico. Number 9 remains Australia. So hello to our friends down under in Australia. And number 10 remains the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom moved into the top 10, a couple of months ago. They got as high as number 7 before sinking back down to number 10, but they've been hanging on at number 10 at least since July 17th. So once again, thank you to all of you listening across the pond in the United Kingdom. But thank you to everyone listening, regardless of where you're listening from, because we do have listeners all over the world. These statistics break down to fractions of a percentage of listenership, and it's really, really gratifying, really, really humbling how many people we've got listening all over the world. And, that's cool because Bitcoin is for everyone, regardless of where you find yourself. But it's especially cool because in some of the countries that don't get all of the attention, that aren't the big financial powerhouses that the United States and Europe has, those are the countries where Bitcoin can help you more than they can help people in the United States or in Europe right now, where we have a stronger currency, a rapidly devaluing, rapidly deflating currency, but not hyperinflating, at least not yet. We don't have as many of the currency controls that a lot of countries have. So it's really cool to know that you're listening in places where Bitcoin is not only more useful, but more immediately useful, where you already see what those of us in the United States and in Europe are going to see eventually, even those people who haven't been orange pilled yet. So hello, and thank you one and all, regardless of where you may be listening from tonight. On to the news. Of course, the price seems to be the news quite often, and the price has, quote unquote, rebounded. If you're watching the price constantly, or if you're a member of that 58K gang on Bitcoin Twitter, you know the price has been bouncing around the $58,000 mark recently. But of course, if you zoom out, you know the Bitcoin is continuing its journey up and to the right. And you know, along those lines, on the last DCA Wednesday, Bitcoin was 58,000. But that, when people were thinking Bitcoin had gone down to 58,000, that was actually up significantly from 2 weeks ago when we purchased at 55,869. So it's just a matter of zooming out. Even if you only zoom out weekly, you know, on a week by week basis, as we do by doing our weekly DCAs, or if you zoom out for a year, Bitcoin's more than doubled in the last 365 days. And of course, if you zoom out for Bitcoin's all-time history, it becomes increasingly clear that nothing stops this train, that the price of Bitcoin's been trending up and to the right. And as Michael Saylor is so famous for saying, it is going up forever, forever, Laura, forever. As I have repeated often since the halving occurred, and I even kind of talked about it before the halving occurred, I believe, well, I didn't say that Bitcoin is ahead of where it was before the halving, because the halving hadn't happened yet, but I believe Bitcoin is ahead of where it would be if this had been a quote-unquote normal cycle. Of course, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if history had rhymed, I think Bitcoin would actually be less expensive in US dollar terms than it currently is. Of course, this has not been a normal cycle thus far, even though it's really just getting underway. It really just started. It's only been a couple months since the halving. The halving only happens about every 4 years. So in the grand scheme of things, we've only just begun, as the song goes. Because we had that huge pump that was kind of the result of the euphoria around the spot Bitcoin ETFs becoming approved and soaking up about $20 billion worth of Bitcoin already. But then, of course, that euphoria died off and the price of Bitcoin pulled back a bit, which is often to be expected, the whole buy the rumor, sell the news thing. But even before the halving, I had repeatedly emphasized that the 4-year bull run that sparks off as the result of the supply shock that is induced by the halving has usually started months after the halving actually occurs. In fact, as I said in the episode where I told you what I predicted was going to happen on halving day, I said the price will probably go down because it always has declined a little bit after the halving. So you normally get the price declining just a little bit after the halving, but then it slowly starts to recover and it begins a gradual climb, which if you look at price on a day-by-day basis, you might not see. But when you zoom out just that little bit, you can recognize that after the halving, Bitcoin dips a little and then slowly begins a steady climb that lasts for a couple of months. And I said it would probably slowly start to climb up from the halving day price sometime during the summer, and where we are right now. And then it doesn't really start taking off until about 6 months to a year after the halving. And if that had been the case, we would not have expected to retake the previous cycle's all-time high, that $69,000 all-time high, until sometime perhaps this fall or winter, around maybe Thanksgiving or Christmas. But all of that, of course, went out the window when the ETFs were approved, because in the euphoria around that, we set a new all-time high of around $73,000 before the halving even happened. So that was certainly something that had never happened before. That certainly made this time different, at least that part of this time. But now that things are settling back to normal, if we can call it that, I remind you that you ain't seen nothing yet, that the real halving induced bull run hasn't even started yet. It shouldn't have started yet. And I don't think it has started yet. And I think that you are going to see faces melt, and maybe it'll start around Halloween or Thanksgiving, probably more like Thanksgiving. But I think certainly by Christmas time, before New Year's. So buckle up, Buttercup, because it's going to get exciting. Cointelegraph ran an article a couple of hours ago, and I'm not a big fan of Cointelegraph. I'm not a big fan of Bitcoin Magazine, but there are very few reliable places to get quote unquote news on Bitcoin. There are a few out there, but in general, I don't have a go-to source other than, what people post or link on Twitter, maybe to some extent Reddit still, even though Reddit was more of a thing, and like maybe the 2016 halving, it seemed like Reddit was where all the people were. And before that, obviously, it was the Bitcoin Talk forum for those of you that are really OGs. But Cointelegraph ran the headline this afternoon, Bitcoin quote unquote parabolic rally may start in Q4 according to historic price data. Well, my reply to that is duh. I think that's one of those no shit Sherlock type of headlines where, we've been talking about it forever. I think everybody who has been in Bitcoin, if this isn't your first cycle, you're starting to put two and two together by now, at least that hey, this is how it goes. We have the halving, and then we have a bull run, and then we have a little bit of a retracement and an accumulation phase. As I said, it shouldn't really start kicking off until Thanksgiving or Christmas, which according to Cointelegraph, they agree when they're saying they don't expect it to start until Q4. The other major news has to do with the U.S. economy and, of course, the Federal Reserve and what the Federal Reserve is expected to do. Yahoo Finance read in the headline this afternoon, Fed minutes. Most officials favor September rate cut. So it's already pretty much baked in. Most people assume that the U.S. Federal Reserve is going to cut interest rates by 0.25% or maybe by as much as 0.5% at their September meeting. Of course, the Fed is currently meeting at their annual Jackson Hole retreat in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, just outside of Jackson, Wyoming. They're meeting there this week, and all eyes are waiting to see what Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell will say on his speech on Friday. Of course, he won't come out and tell us what he's going to do, but economists and the mainstream financial media are always looking to see what hints he's going to drop, and he always drops some sort of hint about if, when, and what the size of the rate cuts might be coming. In anticipation of that, all the speculation about a September rate cut had really kicked into overdrive recently, especially with the news that the U.S. economy is not only bad, but worse than previously reported. Another duh moment. Now, I remind you of that Mark Twain quote that I've repeated over and over quite often on this podcast, that there are three types of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And the damn lie/statistic this week remains the official numbers released by the Labor Department, with the headline on Yahoo Finance yesterday, Fed faced with up to 1 million jobs vanishing in revision. U.S. job growth through March was likely far less robust than initially estimated, which risks fueling concerns about the Fed. The article states, U.S. job growth in the year through March was likely far less robust than initially estimated, which risks fueling concerns that the Federal Reserve is falling further behind the curve to lower interest rates. Goldman Sachs Group, Inc. and Wells Fargo Company economists expect the government's preliminary benchmark revisions on Wednesday to show payrolls growth in the year through March was at least 600,000 weaker than currently estimated, about 50,000 a month, while JP Morgan Chase & Company forecasters see a decline of about 360,000. Goldman Sachs indicates it could be as large as 1 million. There are a number of caveats in the preliminary figure, but a downward revision to employment of more than 501,000 would be the largest in 15 years, my words now. So if it's 1 million, double, more than twice as large as the largest in 15 years. Back to the article, and suggests the labor market has been cooling for longer, perhaps more so than originally thought. The final numbers are due early next year. This is sadly on par for the course. Lie about the numbers, then revise them months later, so that in the course of history, you can say you were correct. But by then, absolutely nobody's paying attention to the lie because the latest statistics are already out, and of course, that's what everybody's worried about. And hey, we corrected it anyway. This kind of reminds me of in Florida, we have the hurricane season is a big deal here. And this kind of reminds me of the annual hurricane season forecast. I know, back to weather. But this applies to Bitcoin. I'll bring it around in just a minute. Because sadly, the weather has also been politicized. And so when they put out the hurricane season forecast, it seems like it's always calling for a record season. Every year they put out the hurricane forecast before hurricane season begins. And they say, because of global warming, we're going to have the worst hurricane season, the biggest storms, the strongest storms on record. But every year they revise the hurricane forecast, and they do so more than halfway through the season, or at least after the peak of the hurricane season, which is when most of the storms traditionally have already happened. They issue this revised forecast, which then allows them to bring their forecast into alignment with reality, with what has already occurred, and then later claim how accurate their forecast was while memory holding the gloom and doom that they had predicted in their original forecast. And so the financial numbers, our economic numbers, are the same way. This is not the first time we've talked about them significantly revising the job numbers. And so one particular instance I talked about, I think even last week, before this news even came out, where they had said the economy grew by like 160,000 jobs. So we're doing great. We're not in a recession. We can't have a recession because under the new definition, even though we've got negative GDP, the jobs are so robust that we're not in a recession. We're doing fantastic. Best economy in 50 years, as Joe Biden has said multiple times. And then, of course, months later, they revised it downward by like more than 300,000. So in fact, not only had we not created 160,000 new jobs, we'd actually lost more than 160,000 jobs. Which, of course, would have meant that we really were in that recession, that everybody already knows if you're one of the thousands of people who's lost your job, and if you just go to the grocery store or try to put gas in your car. Speaking of people looking for jobs, Yahoo Finance ran the headline yesterday, Americans looking for jobs at the highest rate in 10 years. More Americans are looking for jobs as unemployment concerns rise to their highest level in a decade. So much for that best economy in 50 years that the current administration likes to brag about. If you were one of the people who thought, or at least were optimistic, that Kamala Harris was going to flip her stance on Bitcoin, flip her stance on the economy in response to Donald Trump and RFK walloping her in the polls, or RFK surging in the polls, as the case may have been, turning Bitcoin into a campaign issue along with the economy, I think she proved already that that was not going to happen. You know, she had the crypto town hall, or the campaign of the crypto town hall, but even though it was a virtual town hall, she couldn't even bother appearing by Zoom. So her big town hall, she didn't even participate in. And it was kind of a farce anyway, not just because it was an S-Coin town hall, but just in general. Yesterday, though, she took an even step further in the completely opposite direction by announcing that she would be pursuing Biden's current economic policies and his current tax plan, which involves not only jacking taxes through the roof significantly, increasing taxes on individuals and raising the corporate tax rate significantly, but it also includes dramatically increasing capital gains taxes, something that directly affects Bitcoiners, or at least something that Bitcoiners should be concerned about. But not only that, she is proposing a 25% unrealized capital gains tax, which she says will only apply to the very richest, but which is a promise you know is complete BS, because it's a promise that's been made time and time again, and it's a promise that has always proven to not be true. Think the income tax in general, which when it first came around, coincidentally the same time the Federal Reserve was formed, it was only ever supposed to apply to the absolute top 1% richest people in America, but of course has been expanded to include everybody. And if you think about the Bank Secrecy Act rules, the reporting requirements, etc., they were only supposed to apply to the ultra rich. But for example, what used to be the amount of money that would buy a really nice house is now the kind of money that won't even buy a car. Those rules are now ensnaring more and more transactions and more people. And as the US dollar continues to lose currency, continues to lose value, that will be the case to where it starts applying to more and more transactions. One day, it will even apply to your purchasing of just groceries or filling your car with gasoline at this current rate. Now think about the pace that the US dollar has been devaluing. And it won't take very long, as I said, before every American with any kind of savings, or even just a house for that matter, is subject to that horrific theft of that 25% capital gains rate. That doesn't even take into account the fact that we're not even supposed to be living in a socialist country. You are not a worse person. You are not a criminal. You are not someone who should be penalized by the government just because you have scrimped and saved and accumulated some assets. It is not for Kamala Harris to steal from you, even though we kind of have that definition of democracy where it's two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. You know, just because they claim they have the majority of opinion on their side. In the case of a president, they have, what do you call it, the political capital from having freshly won an election. That does not make it right, and it doesn't make it constitutional. It doesn't make it something our founding fathers would have not been abhorred by. Remember, we formed this country because we were pissed off about a really small tax on tea. Zero Hedge tweeted out yesterday, Harris's unrealized gains would obliterate the U.S. economy, linking to their article that says, putting aside the fact that this high-risk idea only amounts to a pittance, $430 billion a year, the introduction of taxing unrealized gains could be one of the worst slippery slopes we ever dare to roll our country's economy down. It goes on to say, we could save $1 trillion just by not sending $100 billion a year to other nations for starters. But I digress. These are his words. I'm continuing on in the article. For an outline of exactly what an unrealized gain is, here's the American Institute on Economic Research. A tax on unrealized capital gains means that individuals are penalized for owning appreciating assets, regardless of whether they have realized any actual income from selling them. If you purchase a stock for $100 this year, for example, and it increases to $110 next year, you would pay the assigned tax rate on the $10 capital gain. You didn't sell the asset, so you don't realize the $10 appreciation, but you must pay the tax regardless. Taxing unrealized capital gains contradicts the basic principles of fairness and property rights essential for a free and prosperous society. Taxation, if we're going to have it on income, should be based on an actual income earned, not on paper gains that may never materialize. Imagine that. So this doesn't even mention the fact that you could very well end up ultimately losing money on that investment, but still being subject to paying the tax. For example, if you'd owned any random S coin and it at the very beginning and it doubled in value during the pump and dump, but the pump happened in late fall and the dump didn't happen until January or sometime in the next year, so you would have had to pay unrealized capital gains on the so-called profit, even though just days later the coin gets rugged, it goes to zero, and ultimately you lost everything you'd put into it. But when you filed your taxes in April, it would have looked like you made tons and tons of money, and you would be forced to pay capital gains on a trade where you actually took it in the shorts. Ultimately, besides being the most insidious form of theft via taxation, this is an attack on those trying to escape inflation. If you think that this is not an attack on the best escape hatch from the collapse of the U.S. dollar ever discovered, I don't know what to tell you, because this is just a horrible idea. If this doesn't have you running to the polls to vote for Donald Trump, even if you hate him personally, I don't know what's going to change your mind. Of course, when it comes to capital gains tax, and especially unrealized capital gains tax, both RFK Jr. and Donald Trump are completely opposed to the Kamala Harris smash and grab. In fact, when it comes to Bitcoin, RFK Jr. promised at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville earlier this year, or just a month ago or less, I guess, that he would eliminate capital gains tax on Bitcoin altogether. Sadly, RFK Jr. has very little chance of actually winning the election, something he appears to be acknowledging this week, as a matter of fact, even going so far as floating the idea that he might actually drop out of the race and endorse Donald Trump. This is amazing given the fact that until a few months ago, RFK Jr. was a Democrat. Of course, so was Donald Trump originally, more than just months ago. Donald Trump switched to the Republican Party, I think, in the late 80s, but that's a trend that we've seen with famous politicians in the United States in the past. Even Ronald Reagan, prior to running for president of the United States, had been a California Democrat, but like many before him, said that the party had left him, not that he was leaving the party. And of course, the same thing has happened to RFK Jr., with the party moving further and further from what he and his family have always stood for. But speaking of RFK Jr., his chances for the election, yesterday the news began breaking, with people on Twitter anyway, including Bitcoin Magazine, posting about it. Bitcoin Magazine tweeted, new Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s running mate, Nicole Shanahan, says they're considering dropping out and joining forces with Donald Trump. Both Kennedy and Trump are pro-Bitcoin. Shanahan, who would be vice president of the United States if RFK Jr. would win the election, appeared on the Impact Theory podcast. And on it, she stated that they were very concerned that if they stayed in the race, it would pull enough votes away from Donald Trump that it would ultimately throw the election to Kamala Harris, and that they were considering dropping out of the race to prevent that from happening. This is a big deal, and this means that not only are they seriously considering it, means it's probably going to happen, because nothing a Kennedy, RFK Jr., or any other Kennedy for that matter, nothing most serious seasoned politicians ever say or do is off the cuff, especially not something this serious. This may not end up happening, but at bare minimum, this was a trial balloon to see how this would be perceived. They float the idea. Kennedy floated with a surrogate. Of course, he floated it with as big a surrogate as you could get, his VP running mate. And that means they're considering it, and they're without actually announcing it, making it official, they're putting the idea out there to gauge the reaction. In any case, this hasn't happened yet, whether it does or not. But the current rumor is that RFK Jr. will announce on Friday that he is dropping out of the race and will endorse Donald Trump for president, and maybe even accept the proposal to participate in Trump's cabinet if elected. People have speculated maybe he might be the head of the EPA. I'd like to see him as the head of the FDA or the CDC, especially with his stance on the COOF and the virus and the vaccines, or maybe even the head of the DOJ, because he is an attorney and he has been involved in litigating against governments to protect the rights of people or the rights of the environment, which gets back to his history as an environmental radical, which is why I kind of was leery about how pro-Bitcoin he really is, because his previous stances in the environment, I have a hard time jiving those with the electricity consumption of Bitcoin mining, but that's neither here or there. Donald Trump signaled yesterday, I think on his Truth social media, that he was open to including RFK Jr. in his cabinet if this does come to be. Cody Sanchez on Twitter, as somebody that I don't follow, but they got 1.6 million views with this tweet, and a lot of people have retweeted it, said, wow, Donald Trump to have in his cabinet, Elon Musk, RFK, endorsing Friday supposedly, Tulsi Gabbard, and Lee Vivek. Would you vote for that lineup? And that tweet has gotten a lot of play. But could you imagine that? This would be a Bitcoin dream team to have, Elon Musk is a clown and he pumps Doge, but he's not an idiot. He has to have a pretty good grasp on Bitcoin. Of course, he's got a history of Bitcoin with both him and Tesla from the previous cycle. So we know he gets it, whether or not he talks about it or whether or not he plays games with his stance on Doge. But RFK Jr. is certainly solidly in the Bitcoin camp. And of course, we know Vivek Ramaswamy is the person that turned Bitcoin, or maybe he didn't necessarily orange pill Donald Trump, but he got him to flip on Bitcoin, or at least to begin to understand Bitcoin and be able to formulate an opinion on Bitcoin and become pro-Bitcoin, ultimately leading him to his speech at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. So that would be pretty amazing to think that just 4 years ago, the idea of a pro-Bitcoin president and a pro-Bitcoin cabinet, especially this pro-Bitcoin, we weren't even considering that. The only country that we thought of that was pro-Bitcoin that maybe we could aspire to be like one day, of course, was El Salvador, with Nayib Bukele putting El Salvador on more or less a Bitcoin standard. But, Donald Trump has a really, really, really high likelihood of winning the election in November. If RFK Jr. drops out and endorses him, I think it becomes a slam dunk. And that would be really exciting because, Trump is just beginning his Bitcoin journey. I don't think he's really dove down the rabbit hole far enough to really grasp it. He's like a lot of people when you first start your journey. You learn about it, you realize it's a good thing, and maybe even get a little bit excited about it, but you really don't know a whole lot. And it takes you that 1,000 hours of research before you're really, truly orange-pilled. And it's just too early for Trump to have been orange-pilled. Even if he ultimately becomes a Bitcoin maxi, it's just too soon for him to be there. I mean, even Michael Saylor used to tweet about how Bitcoin was going to fail. I mean, he thought Bitcoin was going to go away. And we know how that worked out once he finally learned about Bitcoin. I think Donald Trump will take a similar path. Maybe he's really too old to become a maxi because people are set in their ways. He's very, very rich, so he doesn't have an incentive to do anything other than the system that had been working for him for all these years. But by stacking his cabinet with people like Elon, RFK, and Vivek, those are younger people that are already orange-pilled, pretty heavy duty. And that's just really exciting. One more positive note before we get onto our DCA Wednesday stack, and that is MSN reported the headline, I guess it was Friday now, every Norwegian now indirectly owns $27 worth of Bitcoin as sovereign wealth fund ups crypto stake. And the article says that Norway's sovereign wealth fund has increased its holdings of Bitcoin adjacent stocks. So It really talks a lot about Coinbase and BlackRock more than it talks about Bitcoin initially, because those are its largest holdings. And it says that they increased those holdings by 62% this year. But it also does state that they have accumulated some actual Bitcoin itself, writing, quote, "In total, Norway's investment bank now owns 2,446 Bitcoin, worth around $142.9 million. On a per capita basis, Lund says this is the equivalent of $27 for each of Norway's 5.5 million residents." My words now. So that isn't a large amount of Bitcoin, but how many other countries can say that they own any Bitcoin at all, let alone $27 of the Bitcoin for each resident? That is certainly a great start. And I might remind you that when Bitcoin, even if they don't purchase any more Bitcoin, that $27 of the Bitcoin is going to increase exponentially as the price of Bitcoin increases exponentially on its path to hyper Bitcoinization. So not only does it look like they're just getting started, that number is going to change even if they don't add any more sats. Okay, on to what makes today and every Wednesday so special, and that is, of course, that today is DCA Wednesday. For those of you joining us for the first time, if you don't know what DCA is short for dollar cost averaging, and dollar cost averaging is an investment strategy where you invest your money in equal portions at regular intervals regardless of price. So, for the last 160 Wednesdays, we have been investing our equal portion, which we chose to be just $20. And I chose that amount for multiple reasons, but not the least of which is because it's a small enough amount that most of you listening, regardless of where you may find yourself, should be able to come up with $20 a week to convert into Bitcoin. Our regular interval, of course, I chose weekly on Wednesdays. These are both you do you things. If $20 is nothing to you, then of course you might choose a much larger number. Whatever that is up to you. But the idea is that you stick with it, that you use the same amount every week, or whatever your DCA interval is. Most people, regardless of what they're DCAing into, usually DCA on payday. You set a little bit aside for yourself. If you get paid every 2 weeks, then your DCA interval could be every 2 weeks. If you get paid every week, then your DCA could be every week. Some people DCA every day. Again, that's a you do you thing. I think weekly works nicely, but again, the important thing is that you pick a strategy and you stick with it. As I mentioned, this is going to be our 161st stack. We started stacking every Wednesday all the way back on July 28th, 2021, more than 3 years ago. And in that more than 3 years, we've stacked 160 times, converting a total of $3,200 into a stack of 9,741,076 sats. And perhaps as importantly, we did so at an average purchase price of $32,850.59. So that was one of the beautiful things about DCA, is that by buying slowly and surely, we avoided that pitfall of trying to time the market. In fact, I did an episode a week or two ago, or 2 episodes in a row actually, where we recapped the results of our DCAing over the last 3 years and showed that you would have not only would you have a million sats, more than a million sats fewer had you just YOLO'd in on that first Wednesday in July 20th, 2021. Your average purchase price would be about $7,000 higher as well, because we bought the highs, we bought the lows, and we bought everywhere in between. So we have a price that's an average of what the price has been throughout the last 3 years. To grow that stack today, as usual, I'm going to use the handy dandy Cash App. Cash App is not a sponsor of the show. I just love it because it's pretty easy to stack sats on Cash App. They'll let you stack with money that you transfer into the app immediately, and they don't have any restrictions on transferring that Bitcoin straight to your hardware wallet. Other services and exchanges that I've used either make you wait to purchase Bitcoin, or they'll let you purchase the Bitcoin, but they won't let you transfer it out of the exchange for a week or 2 weeks until they're darn sure that money's going to settle, that it actually goes through, so they don't have to claw those Satoshis back from you. That's not the case with Cash App. Again, they're not a sponsor of the show, but every user of Cash App has a referral code. And I firmly believe, regardless of what app or exchange you sign up for, regardless of what products you're purchasing, almost everybody out there has a referral code. For Cash App, I have a referral code. Every user of Cash App has a referral code. If you want to use Cash App and it's available where you are, I would ask that you consider using this referral code that's in the show notes. Just scroll down to whatever app you're listening to, and there's a series of referral codes in the notes. If you do not, you're giving up something that you would receive for using the referral code. In this case, you'll get $5 for using Cash App that you wouldn't normally have, and the podcast will get $5 as well, which I will immediately turn into Satoshis. So not only will you be supporting the podcast, you will be getting paid to support the podcast. And even if you didn't get anything, even if you didn't help support the podcast, even if the podcast wasn't getting a reciprocal $5 for using that referral code, why would you not want the free $5 that you can turn into additional Satoshis? More than 5,000 sats just for using that referral code. But I digress. I already have Cash App open. I already have $20 in Cash App because I had put an order in case Bitcoin went down, and it didn't. Bitcoin went up, so that $20 is still there. So it's just a matter of me tapping on Bitcoin, tapping buy, entering $20, pressing confirm, and boom, just like that, we have purchased another 31,968 Satoshis. That brings our stack up to 9,773,044 sats, getting closer to our kind of unofficial podcast goal of stacking 10 million sats. As I've mentioned before, though, that goal is a sliding goal. Every time we've achieved our goals in the past, we move on to the next goal. Currently, that goal is 10 million sats, and we're getting pretty darn close to achieving that. Next DCA Wednesday, if the price doesn't go crazy, should put us over 9,800,000 sats. So just a handful of DCA Wednesdays to go at current prices to break that 10 million sat mark, and that would be really cool. Today's purchase increased our average cost to $32,947.77. So that's bumped that up about $97. But that's still not too shabby considering Bitcoin's ringing in at about $61,000. In fact, we purchased at $61,155. So about $245 cheaper than when we began the podcast. But that's kind of an insignificant change. Still up and to the right from where we have been the last several podcasts. And this is kind of fun to look at. And it really shouldn't be your goal, because your goal is to have a stack of Satoshis so that when we do achieve hyper-Bitcoinization, or when your local currency collapses, even if the globe hasn't adopted Bitcoin yet, you have your savings in a non-melting ice cube, and something that the government can't take away, and something that can't be devalued. But because it's fun to look at the value of your stack in the terms of the current fiat that your country's using, in this case, the US dollar, in my case, when Bitcoin hits 100,000, and I say when, not if, because I think it's going to hit 100,000 before the end of the year. Of course, nobody has a crystal ball. I'm not making a prediction. That's just my gut feeling. And I don't think it's an unreasonable one, because it doesn't have very far to go. It doesn't even have to double to get there. And as I've said, you ain't seen nothing yet. This Bitcoin bull run is yet to begin. But when Bitcoin does hit 100,000, even if we don't add a single Satoshi to our stack, that means our stack will have a US dollar value of $9,773.04. That is not too shabby, considering we've been stacking just $20 a week, and we've only converted 3,220 US dollars into Satoshis. So more than triple the value of the US fiat that we've converted. If Bitcoin hits 1 million this cycle, or next cycle, or when Bitcoin eventually hits 1 million, that stack will have a US dollar value of $97,730.44. And that would just be insane, an insane level of return compared to any other place you could have put that US dollar, that US fiat. At $10 million, which I firmly believe Bitcoin will hit one day, that means the stack of Satoshis will have almost $1 million in US dollar value. And that would put you into the category of, you're one of those people that the media writes about when they say, if you'd purchased just such and such amount of Bitcoin 10 years ago, you'd be a millionaire today. Well, if you've purchased 9,700,000 Satoshis and Bitcoin hits $10 million, you're just $200,000 shy of being a millionaire. And we intend to grow that stack. When we hit that 10 million sat mark, that would make you a millionaire in US fiat dollar terms, just by Bitcoin going up to $10 million. Of course, Fidelity Investments Director of Global Macro has made the outlandish prediction that, I say outlandish, but I think it could happen. It just seems outlandish. It seems like an extreme prediction, but so did 20,000 just a couple of years ago, or 60,000 4 years ago. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent here. Fidelity's Jurian Timir predicts that by 2038, Bitcoin will hit $1 billion. Now, if we do truly divide everything by 21 million, it's going to go to $1 billion and beyond. But if it does, and who knows whether it'll go there in my lifetime or your lifetime, but if it does, our current stack would be worth $97,730,440. Clearly, what would be life-changing money that would put you into the global elite, solidly in the global elite, just for stacking $20 a week for the last 3 years. That is not too shabby. Before I go, I want to ask you to help support the podcast, and not necessarily in a monetary way. Although if you do feel like you've received value for this podcast, you can contribute some of that value back through the Podcasting 2.0 value for value model by either streaming sats while you're listening or, of course, sending those boosts. If you do send a boost, we read it on the next episode. So if you send a boost today, we'll read it next DCA Wednesday. However, you can also support this podcast by feeding that algorithm monster. And this might even be the most significant way you can help support the podcast. It really, really helps if you rate or review this podcast. That is different depending on the platform you're listening on. But of course, a 5-star rating would be absolutely amazing. Along those lines, you can also feed that algorithm monster by making sure you're following us on Twitter. On Twitter, we are at BTC Bulletin Pod, at BTC Bulletin Pod. Just by following us on Twitter, you will help feed that algorithm monster, which will make it more likely that more people will see our tweets, more people will find out about DCA Wednesday, about this podcast, and hopefully you'll help orange pill a few new plebs simply by clicking follow on Twitter. Besides promoting the podcast and the rankings, I also love to hear from you. And so regardless of whether you're already following us on Twitter or don't use Twitter, please reach out and say hi. Of course, on Twitter, the easy way to do so is by DMing me. Again, it's at BTC Bulletin Pod. We're also on Nostr. If you don't use Twitter or Nostr, you can send me a good old-fashioned email. I check my email all the time. In fact, I have it open right now. And my email is bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. That's bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. But either way, don't forget to join us next Wednesday and every Wednesday as we grow that stack of Satoshis together. But don't forget, regardless of what you do and where you're listening, keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.